All right, so now that we've seen how to create and run a basic TypeScript project, the next thing that we're going to take a look at is we're going to go more in depth into the basics of TypeScript syntax. So what I'm going to do, we're just going to use this app.ts file that we created previously as a sort of notepad to keep track of all the basic syntax. And let's start off by talking about variable declaration. So we already saw the basics of how to declare variables in TypeScript, just with this simple program that we created. But one thing that you may have noticed, depending on your IDE settings, is that even though this program works, we have this red underline under the variable message. And the reason that that's there is because that actually conflicts with a TypeScript global typing. Don't worry too much about what that is, just know that there's already a variable called message in the global TypeScript scope. So all we need to do here is just change the name of this variable from message to something like greeting. And you may find that you run into the same problem if you ever try and create a variable called something like name as well. Okay, so anyway, now that we've changed that, let's talk in a little bit more detail about declaring variables. We already saw here that in order to give a variable a type, all we need to do is add this colon as well as the type name after the name of the variable, right? And that's pretty straightforward. You'll see that in many different places in TypeScript. Obviously, declaring variables in TypeScript programs is just as important as in any other programming language. But I want to reiterate here that this is actually a lot different than how things worked in JavaScript, because in JavaScript, only values had types. In other words, the variables themselves were just containers that we could put whatever value we wanted into. So, you know, if we were to, in a JavaScript file, say something like let x equals 4, well, later on in the program, we can then say something like x equals hello. Later on, then we can say x equals, and we can set it to a Boolean. Then later on, we could set it even to an object if we wanted to. And in JavaScript, that wouldn't cause any problem, right? This is what we mean when we say in JavaScript that values have types, but variables themselves don't have types. However, in TypeScript, what I just said isn't true, right? In TypeScript, the variables themselves actually have types. In other words, when we create a variable, this container that we can put values into, we get to define a specific type so that that variable can only hold values of that type. All right, so again, this is the difference between static typing, which TypeScript uses, and dynamic typing, which JavaScript uses. So that's just something to keep in mind. And in case you're wondering what the other types are in TypeScript, that's something that we're going to talk about in more detail next. So we'll see that in addition to strings, there are numbers, booleans, etc. But we'll be getting to that next. So for now, let's just keep moving. So now that we've seen how to declare variables in TypeScript, and we know about, just some of the details of how variables in TypeScript are different from variables in JavaScript, let's take a look at how functions work in TypeScript. Now, functions in TypeScript are gonna look a lot like JavaScript, but with these extra TypeScript types, right? Much like how we saw with variable declaration, add it into the mix. So just to give you an idea here, let's create a simple function, and we'll call this function something like double. And what it'll do is it'll take a number and double it. So now in JavaScript, what this would have looked like is we would just specify the name of the variable we would want to allow the user to pass in, and then we could return whatever type we wanted. However, in TypeScript, just to make sure that all the code that interacts with this function is aware of the different types that are at play, what we have to do is we have to not only add types to the arguments, right, such as x here, but we also have to give a type to the function itself. All right, and this type refers to the type of the value that a function returns. All right, so in the case of our double function here, the value that it takes as an argument is going to be a number. So what we would do is we would say x and then colon number. Okay, so that's what the syntax for that looks like. And then in order to specify the type that this function returns, what we need to do is after the function declaration itself, right, after the closing parentheses of the function's arguments, we actually put a colon again, and then we specify the type that that function returns. So in this case, we're saying that this double function takes a number as an argument, right? That's what we can see here by x:number, and it returns a number as its return value, okay? So that's what this :number after the function's parentheses means. And then of course, the value that we return from the function has to actually match up with this type that we specify here. If we were to try and say something like return hello, right? I didn't mean to do that. Let's click cancel. If we were to try and return a string or something like that, we're gonna see that TypeScript gives us an error saying that the type string is not assignable to type number. Basically, all that means is we're returning a string and we should be returning a number, which is the type of the function. Okay, so that's just something to look out for. And another thing to be aware of, this is something that can occasionally cause problems for developers, is if you don't return a value at all, that's going to produce a little warning as well, right? So if you delete the return statement and hover over this number type now, you'll see that it says a function whose declared type is neither void nor any must return a value. Now, don't worry about the specifics of that error message. We don't know what void or any is yet, but basically all that means is you said you were going to return a number and you're not returning a number. So in that case, we would just need to make sure that no matter what happens in this function, we return a number. So we'll just put our return statement back and we'll see that that will get rid of the errors there. So that's the basics of working with functions. And just to address the error that we saw that mentioned a type void or any for a function, let's talk about the type void for a function, because there are a lot of cases in JavaScript and TypeScript programs where we don't necessarily want our function to return a value, right? And this is generally in the case of functions that do something like print something to the console, or functions that are just supposed to have some sort of side effect or do something rather than compute a value. Now, in those cases, right, if we were to say, function, and we'll create a function called say hello, and the purpose of this function, as you can probably guess, is just to print a string to the console. Well, in that case, this function is not going to have any type, so we can either leave the type off completely, which I'll go into more detail on in just a minute here, or we can set the type to void, which makes it very explicit that this function does not return a value, right? So in this case, if we were to just say console.log and print out hello to the console, we're going to see that that does not produce a red underline like our double function did before when we tried to just return nothing, right? All right, so that's the void type with functions. In case you're wondering about some of the other function syntaxes that are available in JavaScript, such as arrow function syntax, well, all of those syntaxes can be used with TypeScript as well. And it's actually kind of interesting what the type looks like for these functions when we declare them this way. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just define another double function. And actually, let's declare a triple function. So we'll say const, and we'll call it triple. And then we're going to just define this using arrow function syntax. So what we'll do is in parentheses, we'll say x, and we'll use the same syntax that we used before. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put an arrow, and after the arrow, we'll say x times 3 and return that value. Now, in this case, if you hover over this triple variable in your IDE, now you might notice that even though we specified the data type for the argument here, we never actually explicitly defined the return type for this function. And that's something that's important to recognize as well, is that in TypeScript, there are certain situations where TypeScript can actually infer the type of a variable just based on how we declared it. All right, so let's say that we were to just say let x equals 100, right? Well, in this case, if we hover over x, we'll see that TypeScript has actually already recognized x as a number. And furthermore, if we try and assign a different value to x by saying something like x equals hello, well, even though we didn't explicitly define the type of x, TypeScript has automatically assigned a static type to it. All right, so just because we've decided to leave off the type from this variable declaration doesn't mean that we can just go changing the type of value that it contains, right? TypeScript will automatically assign types to a variable just based off of the value that we put inside of it. Now, this can get a little bit trickier, of course, if we define a variable without actually assigning an initial value to it. So if we just say something like let x, and then later on try and assign a value to it, well, what you'll see if you hover over x, which has this little gray underline underneath it, is that it says variable x implicitly has any type, but a better type may be inferred from usage. So what that means is that because we haven't explicitly given it a starting value, TypeScript has just said, all right, well, I don't know what type you're going to assign to this thing. That's a little too complicated. So I'm just going to say that this can contain any type of value. And that is the any type in TypeScript that we'll talk about in more detail very shortly. But anyway, in this situation, if we wanted to explicitly make sure that x was a number, all we would have to do is just add :number after it. And that would make sure that x is considered a number when it receives a value. And it would make sure that the value that we assign to it at some point would be a number and not some other type. So anyway, the point here is that TypeScript can infer types. And in the case of our triple function up here, as you can see, that's actually saved us a good bit of code for the type declaration, right? If we wanted to explicitly say that triple was going to be a function that takes a number as an argument and returns a number, well, here's what the type for that looks like. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move the declaration for this function down here and comment it out. So if we wanted to define this triple variable but not immediately assign the function to it for some reason, then what that would look like is we would say const triple, and then we would put a colon, and the type for functions, it basically looks a lot like the arrow function syntax in JavaScript, but with types instead of actual values. Let me show you what I mean by that. If we wanted to say that triple was going to be a function that takes a number as an argument and returns a number, all we need to do inside of here is say x : number, and then an arrow and number comes after that, right? So you can see that TypeScript doesn't like this because we declared this as a const. So if we change this to let, we'll see that it's a little more lenient with us. But now you can see that that type, right? This is a function that takes a number as an argument and returns a number. That's been assigned to this variable so that later on, if we wanted to say triple equals and then actually assign a working function that fits that signature to the variable, we'd be able to do that. All right, so anyway, that's just what the syntax for declaring function types looks like if we ever have a need to do that. You'll also notice that included in here is a variable name. You don't necessarily have to have this name match the argument name once you assign a function to it, right? For example, if down here we said something like y, and change this to y times 3, it doesn't matter that in the type declaration we used x, and then in the actual function signature we used y. It recognizes that this is a function that takes a number as an argument, and so is this one. All right, so anyway, hopefully that syntax for working with functions in TypeScript is making sense to you. The last thing that I wanted to talk about here is the syntax for working with arrays in TypeScript. This is actually pretty straightforward because all we have to do in order to go from a basic type, such as a string or a number, to an array of those data types, such as an array of strings or an array of numbers, is add square brackets after the type name. So if we were to go down to the bottom here and say something like let names, and we wanted to make this an array of strings, well, all we have to do in that case is say string and put square brackets after that. And then this is going to expect whatever comes after to be an array. So in our case here, we might say something like Sean, John, Bob, whatever, right? So that would be an array of strings. If we wanted an array of numbers, we could say let numbers equals, and the type of this one, actually we wouldn't put the equals sign, we would put a colon. The type of this one would be number, and that would be followed by square brackets as well, and we could just say 1, 2, and 3. All right, now something that's important to recognize here is that having a specific type declaration for an array is going to be a little bit more important in some cases than having a specific type declaration for a. So the reason that is because it's pretty common in JavaScript and TypeScript programs to create an array, but have that array start off as empty. It's generally more common to do that than it is to create a variable and not assign a value to it. So, if we just wanted to start off our names array as empty and add those names later on, then having this string with square brackets after it tells TypeScript what type to expect in that array. However, if we were to just take this type declaration off, well, TypeScript doesn't now know what type that array is going to contain. So if you hover over names, what you're going to see actually is this weird never type. All right, now the never type in TypeScript, its main purpose is really just to show developers when they've done something wrong and forgotten to specify an important type. And in our case here, since TypeScript is going to have no idea what type of data this array will contain, it's going to tell the developer when they actually try and use this array, like if they try and say names.push, and we'll try and add something onto here, right? It's going to tell the developer, if you hover over this, it says argument of type string is not assignable to parameter of type never. And as a matter of fact, nothing is ever going to be assignable to the parameter of type never, because that's the purpose of the never, is to cause this kind of warning to pop up when you've forgotten to do things like assign a specific type for an array. So if we just add string with square brackets after this, we'll see that that error goes away. But anyway, besides that, arrays in TypeScript work pretty much like you'd expect them to in JavaScript. There are a few small details that we'll talk about later on in the course, but all you really need to know is what the type declaration for arrays looks like at this point. So now that we've covered the most important pieces of TypeScript syntax, and these are just really the pieces of syntax that go above and beyond basic JavaScript syntax, the next thing that we're going to do is take a look at some of the main TypeScript types.